Hi, Mystery Recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a crime thriller film called Henry's Crime. Spoilers ahead. Watch out and take care. The movie opens in Buffalo, New York, where we meet a man named Henry who works at a toll booth and lives a dull, monotonous life. One morning, after finishing his night shift, he returns home to have breakfast with his wife Debbie. As they chat, she brings up wanting to have a child, but Henry seems hesitant about the idea. This upsets Debbie, who asks if he still loves her, and though he says yes, his expression says otherwise. However, their conversation is interrupted by a knock on the door, and it turns out to be Henry's friend Eddie. With him is a man named Joe, who's vomiting profusely in the front yard. They bring Joe inside, and Debbie, who's a nurse, takes care of him. Eddie then informs Henry that they were heading to play baseball, but since Joe is sick, he can't participate now. He invites Henry to join them instead, and although the man is reluctant at first, he eventually agrees. "Can the puking guy stay with my wife?" "Sure, Henry." "All right." But shortly after, they arrive at the front of Buffalo Bank, where Eddie and his friend claim that they're just going to withdraw some money from the ATM, but it turns out they're actually robbers. As they put on masks and head inside the bank with guns, a confused Henry stays in the car and soon realizes the vehicle's been stolen and started by tampering with the wires. Moments later, a security alarm goes off and Eddie and his friend run away from the bank. A security guard, Frank, notices Henry wearing the same jersey as the robbers and restrains him. At the police station, the cops realize that Henry wasn't actually the robber and ask for his friends' names, but he refuses to say anything. The poor guy is thus sentenced to 3 years in prison for a crime he didn't even commit. Once there, he meets his cellmate Max, who's an ex-con. Max asks why he's in prison, and Henry explains that he's been convicted of bank robbery, but clarifies that he was wrongfully accused. The two men become good friends, and Max seems like a wise man who tells Henry that the real crime is not pursuing one's dreams. He says that all the prisoners there once had big dreams, but something went wrong in their lives, leading them to end up here. He asks Henry what his dreams are, but the latter shockingly reveals that he has none. The scene then shifts to 6 months later when Debbie pays Henry a visit in prison and surprisingly reveals that she has fallen in love with someone else. Strangely, Henry doesn't appear to be even slightly hurt and instead wishes her well in life. The scene then cuts to a year later where Henry is seen hanging out with Max and other inmates. Max reveals that every time he has a parole review, he tells the parole officer that if he is released, he will break into his house, kill his dog, burn it down, and cut out the tongues of everything that breathes. At least he already killed the dog. Its tongue is safe. This is because Max never wants to leave prison and has come to accept it as his home. Later, Henry asks Max what his dream is, and the old man responds that he's living his dream, which is to stay in jail. Sometime later, it is time for Henry's parole review, and it seems like he doesn't want to leave prison either. However, Max urges him to behave and hopes that they will never see each other again. Afterward, Henry is granted parole and is finally released from prison early. He returns home, only to be surprised to find that Debbie is now in a relationship with Joe, the puking guy, and is even pregnant. While he's collecting his things, Joe approaches him to offer him a job, which turns out to be a pyramid scheme, so Henry refuses. Joe thanks him for not giving his name to the police, but Henry responds that he doesn't even know his name. That night, Henry watches a woman's commercial on TV. What's a woman's commercial? Promoting the city lottery called Buffalo. The next day, feeling bored and unsure of what to do, he returns to the Buffalo Bank and begins to stare for no reason. Suddenly, a car appears out of nowhere and runs him over. The driver turns out to be a woman named Julie, who begins calling him an idiot, but the security guard Frank scolds her for being distracted on the phone. He seems kind and even helps Henry take him to a nearby cafe. Julie offers to take him to a hospital, but Frank insists that he is fine, and he soon realizes that she's the same woman from the lottery commercial, and he wants to do a Buffalo things to her. After Julie leaves, Frank goes to urinate, during which he reads an old newspaper article hanging on the bathroom wall. The article describes the robbery of the Buffalo Bank, which took place in the 1930s during Prohibition. The robbery involved a gang of criminals using an underground passageway formerly used by bootleggers. The passageway is located in an adjacent theater where the gang carried out the multi-million-dollar heist. Upon seeing this, Henry comes up with an idea and goes to meet Max in prison. He reveals that his dream is to rob the Buffalo Bank, the same crime for which he was wrongfully convicted. He asks Max for help, but the old man is shocked by such a ridiculous dream and refuses to leave the prison, which is his home, and his totally not ridiculous dream. Henry, however, urges him to reconsider, insisting that he doesn't want Max to waste his life and die behind bars. Afterwards, Henry goes to the theater adjacent to the bank, where he notices Julie rehearsing a Russian play with her team. The director appears very harsh and scolds Julie for doing a poor job, leaving her frustrated. She then notices Henry, and the two head to a nearby cafe, where he praises her acting. "It's better than mine." She feels flattered, and also thanks him for not suing her for the accident. In another scene, we see Max at his parole review, and surprisingly, he behaves well and is granted release this time, even though he's threatened to kill the guy's family at least 30 times. Sometime later, Henry arrives to pick him up, but Max is stunned to see that Henry doesn't even have a car. This annoys him, and he tries to return to prison, but Henry calms him down, explaining that the bus station isn't far. Afterward, they begin plotting the robbery and head to the cafe, where Max notices that the map is 80 years old. He says the plan is foolish because they cannot rely on such an outdated newspaper. He asks Henry if he has a gun, but the latter says no, because he doesn't want to hurt anyone. The two men then head to the bank, where they pretend to be new customers. Max uses his charm to make the employee open up about the bank's history. He reveals that when he was a kid, his uncle had put all his money in a vault here and said the place would stand for 300 years. He asks if the vault is still in the same location as before, and the employee confirms that everything here is still in the same spot as it was in 1891. The employee then asks what kind of account they would like to create, but the duo says they'll think about it, and they leave, while Frank notices them. Next, the two head to the theater to look for the tunnel. When they come across Julie again, Max informs her that he was once an actor and used to perform in the same theater. He uses his charm to bond with a staff member, Simon, and asks him to give them a tour of the place. During this, Max begins talking about the old tunnel from many years ago. The naive Simon reveals that the tunnel's exit is in the lead actor's dressing room, but it was apparently sealed in 1931. Max then volunteers to work in the theater, to which Simon excitedly agrees. Elsewhere, Henry and Julie begin chatting, and she asks if Max is his dad, to which he says no. She then asks what he does, and he reveals that he was recently released from prison. It seems he has started to like her, so he asks her out for dinner after rehearsal, to which she agrees, without even asking what he was in prison for. In the evening, Henry carefully gets ready for his date, and soon arrives at the restaurant, where Julie arrives late and stressed. She reveals how tired she is of this place, and that after the play, she plans to move to Hollywood to pursue acting. She asks him why he went to jail, so he reveals that he thought he was going to play baseball and was wrongfully framed. He then reveals that he has plans to rob the bank for real this time, which leaves her shocked and amused. Afterward, they arrive at her place, where she makes him read the script and practice for the role. Julie asks him to play the lead, and surprisingly, Henry does an excellent job, showing a natural talent for acting. One thing leads to another, and the two end up passionately making love that night. The next day, Henry brings Julie to his place, where Max doesn't notice her at first and blurts out about the robbery. He then begins to panic, but Henry assures him that Julie knows everything and won't tell anyone. Max gets mad at him for telling her, but Henry manages to calm him down by offering him bacon. Later, Max arrives at the theater to volunteer, and he soon realizes they must gain access to the male lead's dressing room. This will give them access to the old tunnel, allowing them to keep digging without anyone noticing. He comes up with a plan to remove the male lead and replace him with Henry, but Henry doesn't think it's a good idea, as he has no knowledge or skill for acting. The next day, the male lead of the play resigns, as he has been offered an even bigger role elsewhere. This frustrates the director and the entire team, so Max takes advantage of the situation and tries to convince Julie that Henry is perfect for the role. She refuses, pointing out that Henry has never acted in his life, but Max continues to pressure and even reveals that it would help with their robbery. Julie is shocked to realize that Max orchestrated the whole thing for their mission, but she reluctantly agrees to recommend Henry for the role. The director obviously refuses to hire him, but he gives Henry a fair chance to audition. It starts very badly, but eventually he performs exceptionally well, impressing everyone. As a result, Henry is cast as the male lead, which gives him access to the tunnel that will lead to the bank's vault. Soon, the two men break through the wall of the dressing room and discover that the tunnel is sealed. They realize it's too much work to accomplish on their own, so they decide to hire someone. That evening, they meet Joe, who is depressed after his pyramid scheme failed and left him unable to support Debbie and the baby. The two offer him a role role in their heist, and the desperate man eagerly accepts. Over the next few days, the trio works hard to dig the tunnel, and Henry also tirelessly practices for his role in the play. One evening, as they leave the theater, Frank suddenly appears out of nowhere and stops them. He says he's been watching since he first saw them at the bank and noticed them lingering around the theater. Frank admits he suspects they're planning a robbery, but doesn't want to snitch, and instead, he wants in. He explains that once a month an armored truck collects cash from partner branches and brings it to the vault, sometimes depositing $8 to $12 million. He thus offers to be their inside man, promising to help bypass security and disable the alarm. However, the trio suspects it might be a trap and asks Frank why he's doing all this. Frank opens up, revealing that years ago his wife fell seriously ill, and despite his 30 years of service at the bank, they offered him no help. He spent all his retirement savings on her treatment, but she still succumbed to the illness, leaving him heartbroken and penniless. He reveals that he's retiring in just 2 weeks, so he wants to secure his retirement funds. Upon hearing his story, the group sympathizes with him and finally agrees to involve him in the plan. The next day at the theater, rehearsal is happening as usual, but the director continues to scold Julie for lacking emotion. He says that she has never loved anyone, which is why she doesn't understand feelings. This makes her feel terrible, and she begins to cry and walks away, with Henry following her. He tries to comfort her, but she explains that she's a damn good actress, but people have always told her she's cold as ice. Henry reassures her that she is not cold before kissing her, and it seems their relationship is deepening. That night, Henry and Max are preparing for the heist when all of a sudden there's a knock on the door. Henry opens it and is shocked to see Joe there, along with his troublesome friend Eddie. It turns out that Joe, who had been drunk, revealed everything to Eddie, who now wants to be a part of the heist. Max dislikes him immediately and points out that Joe may have just blurted out nonsense, and they're not planning anything. But Eddie doesn't believe him, and the two get into a heated argument. Things nearly escalate into a physical fight, but Henry intervenes just in time and reluctantly agrees to include Eddie in the plan. The next day, Henry arrives at the theater and discovers that the play's premiere has been moved up to the same night as the robbery. This puts him in a difficult position, as he has fallen in love with Julie and doesn't want to abandon her. However, Max reminds him that he was the one who pulled him out of prison to join the heist, so he can't back out at this point. In the evening, Henry informs Julie that they have to rob the bank on the first night of the show, which means he will have to leave after that. This infuriates her, especially since Henry is now the lead in the play, and the play won't happen without him. She thinks he only used her to get inside the theater, but Henry tries to reassure her that this isn't the case. He tries to convince her to meet him in California after the robbery, but she refuses and says it's okay for him to leave. Days later, the big night finally arrives, and everyone in the theater is busy preparing for the premiere. Elsewhere, the money truck arrives at the bank and enters the vault, after which Frank gives the signal. Henry continues performing in the play, but as soon as his scene is over, he rushes to help his friends. Max, on the other hand, goes to the tunnel with Joe and Eddie to proceed with the heist. However, Joe begins to get sick again and continues vomiting, while Eddie, who seems skilled with machinery, uses welding equipment to access the vault. Afterward, they finally manage to open the vault and steal a large sum of money. Everything goes smoothly as they place the cash in sacks and carry it into the dressing room. However, suddenly, Eddie shows his true colors and points a gun at Max, ordering him to step aside. He then tells Joe to load all the money into the car so they can leave. Joe pleads with him not to do this, as they already have their share, but Eddie refuses. At this moment, Henry enters the room and Eddie threatens him as well, while hitting Max with the gun. However, Max soon gets up and disarms Eddie before he can brutally attack him. The two men struggle over the gun, and in the scuffle, it accidentally fires and hurts Henry's leg. Afterward, Max manages to knock Eddie down, so they leave him gagged and tied in the tunnel. Following this, the rest of the gang takes the money to the car and drives off. However, along the way, Henry suddenly asks them to stop, saying he needs to go back to the theater. Joe is confused, but Max understands his situation and tells him to go. Henry soon returns to the theater and interrupts the play while his leg is bleeding. In a daring move, he publicly declares his love for Julie, leaving both her and the audience speechless, and as confused as the audience of this movie is at this point. Coincidentally, though, this narrative also fits the play's story, which makes the audience excited. An angry Julie tells Henry to leave, but he refuses and asks her to meet him in Moscow. She refuses, but the audience begins cheering for her to accept him. The director is also intrigued, so he dims the lights and urges Julie to give her answer. Julie doesn't say yes aloud, but a sudden smile reveals that she has accepted his love. She then leans in to kiss him, but before we can see what happens, the movie comes to an end.